118 organizations. Gone. In a single afternoon. Not by war, not by riot, but by a decree that nobody in the Western press understood. April 15th, 2026. The Ministry of Territorial Administration in Burkina Faso signs a document. 118 NGOs and civil society groups dissolved, banned, finished. The headlines came fast. Junta cracks down. Repression. Attack on civil society. They all missed the point, because this wasn't a crackdown. This was the third move in a three-step chess sequence that began 2 years ago. And if you don't understand the first two moves, the third one looks like chaos. Here is what they didn't tell you. These 118 organizations had 9 months to comply with a simple legal requirement. Move your accounts to the National Treasury. 9 months. That's not a surprise. That's not a trap. That's a deadline. Every single one of them refused. Ask yourself why a humanitarian organization, one that exists allegedly to help people, would refuse financial transparency with the very government of the country it claims to serve. That question is the entire story. Soldiers left Burkina Faso. French Special Forces, 400 of them, were expelled in 2023. The military hardware was gone. The boots on the ground were gone. But the influence didn't leave. It changed uniforms. Banks came, NGOs arrived. And what looked like international aid was, according to documents reviewed by Burkina Faso's security services, something else entirely. Today, we're going to trace 3 steps, 3 precise, deliberate, surgical moves that together form the most significant sovereignty operation in West Africa in 60 years. No Western outlet has connected all 3. Cambridge University Press scholars predicted this mechanism a decade ago. Traore just made it real. Stay with us. Because by the end of this, you will never read another humanitarian crisis headline the same way again. The headline read, Burkina Faso junta cracks, down on civil society. It was wrong, not partially wrong, entirely wrong. Here's what actually happened, and why the gap between that headline and the reality is the most important blind spot in African geopolitical coverage right now. July 2025. Ibrahim Traore's government signs a new law, not a crackdown law, a compliance law. Every NGO and civil society organization operating in Burkina Faso must update its legal registration within 12 months. 12 months. The government is not asking organizations to leave. It is asking them to be transparent about who they are, who funds them, and where their money goes. That is the entire requirement. Reasonable, measurable, legal. And yet, within a month, one specific organization finds itself in trouble. The International NGO Safety Organization, INSO, headquartered in The Hague, Netherlands. An organization whose stated mission is to keep humanitarian workers safe in conflict zones. Noble on paper. On July 31st, Burkina Faso suspends INSO's operations. The official reason, unauthorized collection of sensitive data. INSO issues a denial. They claim the information they collect is, quote, exclusively for the purpose of keeping humanitarians safe, and that it is not confidential and is largely already known to the public. Their words. But here is where the story turns. A suspended organization, one that has been told officially and legally to stop operations, should stop. That is what suspension means in every legal system on the planet. INSO did not stop. October 2025, 2 months after the suspension order. Burkina Faso's security minister, Mahamadou Sana, stands before cameras and makes an announcement that the Western press will report with minimum necessary detail and maximum outrage directed at entirely the wrong target. 8 people working for INSO have been arrested. 1 Frenchman, 1 French-Senegalese woman, 1 Czech national, 1 Malian, 4 Burkinabe nationals. the country director and his deputy among them. The charge is not humanitarian misconduct, the charge is espionage. According to official statements from Burkina Faso's security services, confirmed in reporting by Al Jazeera and France 24, these individuals had continued to clandestinely conduct activities, including information collection and covert meetings, both in person and online, after the suspension order had been issued. They did not pause. They did not appeal. They went underground. And there is more. The security minister stated that they had been collecting information about Burkina Faso's security situation, its political environment, and its administrative structure, and records indicate transferring that information to foreign powers, not humanitarian data, political, security, and administrative intelligence collected after a legal ban moved outside the country. Now go back and read the Western headlines. Junta arrests European humanitarian workers. Burkina Faso targets NGO staff. Crackdown on civil society intensifies. Not a single headline led with the fact that these individuals continued operating after a suspension order. Not one outlet asked what exactly they were collecting. Not one journalist noted that the government's objection was not to humanitarian data, but to political and security intelligence being extracted from a sovereign nation and transmitted abroad. This is not investigative failure. This is editorial choice. Because asking those questions would force a different kind of story. A story that does not fit the template. African junta represses civil society. That has been the default frame for every Western outlet covering Burkina Faso since 2022. Consider what that frame requires. It requires the reader to begin with a set of assumptions that the military government is the aggressor, that the organizations it targets are innocent, that the international community's concern is purely humanitarian, and that the historical context of colonialism and post-colonial influence is irrelevant or at best secondary. Every editorial choice flows from those assumptions. Which facts to lead with, which voices to quote, which questions to ask, and, crucially, which questions to skip. INSO is not the story. INSO is the proof of concept. What happened in the second half of 2025 was not an isolated incident. It was the moment Burkina Faso's government confirmed, with evidence, with documented arrests, with stated charges, what it had suspected for years, that some organizations operating under humanitarian cover in its territory were engaged in something structurally different from humanitarianism. And if that is true for one organization, a well-funded Netherlands-based internationally recognized body, the question that inevitably follows is this: how many others? The answer was given on April 15, 2026, 118. That is how many organizations, given 9 full months to demonstrate basic financial transparency, chose to refuse. 118 organizations that, when asked by the sovereign government of the country they operate in to move their accounts to the national treasury so the government could see for the first time where the money actually comes from, said no. Think about that. Not, we need more time. Not, we have legal concerns. Just, no. You do not refuse financial transparency unless transparency would reveal something you cannot afford to reveal. That is not an accusation. That is logic. And it leads directly into the deeper structure, the one that African scholars named decades ago, that Cambridge University Press documented in a landmark book, and that Ibrahim Traore is now dismantling with surgical precision. But who was funding the organizations that refused to open their books? And why does that answer lead straight back to a building in Brussels? 8. INSO staff, 3 Europeans, arrested not for helping people, but for continuing intelligence operations after a legal ban, according to Burkina Faso's security services. That is not humanitarianism. That is a cover story that collapsed. But INSO was only the visible part, Because behind those 8 individuals, 118 other organizations were quietly doing the same thing they had always done, moving money through foreign accounts, filing no reports, answering to no one in Ouagadougou. And the question no one is asking is the most important one of all. Why would a humanitarian organization, for 9 months straight, choose a foreign bank account over the national treasury of the country it claims to serve? In 1960, the last French soldier was supposed to leave West Africa. They didn't. Not really. The uniform changed. The mechanism changed. The language changed. But the extraction, the flow of resources, information, and decision-making power from African soil to European capitals, that never stopped. It simply found a more elegant vehicle. To understand what Burkina Faso did in April 2026, you have to understand a concept that African scholars have been writing about for decades, but that has never once made it into a mainstream YouTube video about the Sahel, the NGO industrial complex. In 2015, Cambridge University Press published a book called From Empires to NGOs in the West African Sahel. The argument, documented, sourced, peer-reviewed, is precise. The post-colonial West African Sahel became fertile terrain for a new form of governance realized through non-governmental organizations. These organizations had their roots in Europe and North America. Their funding came from Western governments and foundations. Their reports went back to the same institutions that produced colonial administration, but now with new letterheads and new vocabulary. The researchers named it non-governmentality. The idea that sovereignty, the basic ability of a government to govern, had been hollowed out not by armies, but by a dense web of externally funded organizations that replaced state functions, gathered on the ground intelligence, shaped public opinion, and created dependencies that made African governments answerable to donors in Geneva and Washington before they were answerable to citizens in Ouagadougou. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented institutional analysis from one of the world's most respected academic publishers. And when you read it, when you actually read what these scholars identified as the structural role of the NGO ecosystem in post-colonial Sahel governance, the events of the past 9 months in Burkina Faso do not look like a crackdown. They look like a diagnosis followed by a surgery. Think about what the NGO ecosystem actually does in a country like Burkina Faso. It runs schools where the state cannot. It funds clinics. It trains local administrators. It employs thousands of educated Burkinabe citizens, which means those citizens are financially dependent on foreign-funded institutions rather than on the sovereign state. It runs parallel reporting chains. Information about conditions on the ground flows upward to donors in European capitals, not to the Ministry of Territorial Administration in Ouagadougou. It shapes the terms of public debate. Which issues are development priorities? Which communities receive resources? Which civil society voices get amplified internationally and which are ignored? And here is the deepest layer. Because the NGO is the employer, the provider, the funder, the gatekeeper of international legitimacy, communities learn to appeal to the NGO, not to the government. Local leaders learn to frame their problems in the language of international development, not in the language of national governance. The sovereign state becomes increasingly irrelevant to daily life, not because it has failed, but because a parallel structure has been built to replace it, piece by piece, grant by grant, project by project. Over 60 years, this creates something profound, a form of governance that looks local but is structured globally. A system in which the formal sovereignty of the Burkinabe state is real on paper and hollowed out in practice. October 16th, 2025. 3 days after the INSO arrests, Burkina Faso's Council of Ministers adopts a new decree. All approved NGOs and associations are required to domicile their accounts. Every account, all funds, grants, subsidies, donations, exclusively with the Treasury Deposits Bank. the BDT, the national institution. The official justification, traceability of funds, prevention of money laundering, compliance with international commitments on counterterrorism financing. The real significance, for the first time in the history of independent Burkina Faso, the government would be able to see where the money actually comes from. Not the official reporting, not the donor brochures, the actual money, the wire transfers, the amounts, the origins. That moment, that decree was not a punishment. It was an audit. And the response from the NGO sector was immediate and revealing. 118 organizations said no. Not, we need guidance on implementation. Not, we welcome transparency but request clarification. No. After 9 months, 9 full months from July 2025 to April 2026, 118 organizations had not moved a single account, had not taken a single administrative step toward compliance. Financial Africa confirmed this. A PA News confirmed it. Ecofin agency confirmed it. The government gave them the maximum possible runway, and they chose, collectively and deliberately, to refuse. The question that Western outlets are not asking, and will not ask because the answer is uncomfortable, is this: what was in those accounts that 118 organizations would rather lose their legal standing than reveal? There are a few possible answers. The first, many of these organizations were receiving funding from sources that, if disclosed, would reveal direct conflicts of interest between their stated humanitarian mission and the geopolitical interests of their funders. Western governments, foundations linked to intelligence communities, or corporate entities with extractive interests in the region. The second, some of these organizations had been, in the language of the Cambridge researchers, performing state substitute functions, running parallel governance structures that were financially dependent on external principles, not on the Burkinabe population they claimed to serve. The third, and most structurally significant, the foreign bank account was not an administrative choice. It was an architectural requirement. Because the entire funding model, the grants, the project cycles, the reporting chains, was designed to flow through external financial systems, visible to foreign donors and invisible to the sovereign government. That is not humanitarianism. That is a financial architecture designed, consciously or not, to preserve external leverage over internal affairs. The soft occupation framework does not need armies. It needs accountants. It needs program officers. It needs annual reports submitted to Brussels and Geneva that the government in Ouagadougou never sees. And what Traore found when he finally saw the money trail, that was the moment everything changed. On October 16, 2025, Burkina Faso issued a single decree requiring all NGO accounts to move to the national treasury. The government did not ask for explanations. It did not demand confessions. It simply asked, "Show us the money." 118 organizations spent 9 months deciding that they would rather be dissolved than answer that question. But here is what the mainstream narrative missed entirely. A book published by Cambridge University Press predicted this exact dynamic. The NGO as successor to the colonial administrator, more than a decade ago. African scholars named it. African governments are now acting on it. And the 3-step strategy Traore used to get here, precise, deliberate, and entirely misunderstood by every Western outlet, is the blueprint that the rest of the Sahel is already studying. Let's be precise. Ibrahim Traore, pronounced Traore, is 36 years old. A captain, a man who came to power in a September 2022 transition that most Western outlets still reflexively call a coup. He has survived, according to reports tracked by regional security analysts, multiple documented attempts to remove him from power. He is still standing, and what he has done since taking power is not what the headlines describe. It is not chaos. It is not impulsive authoritarianism. It is, and this is the argument that no long-form video has yet made in full, a three-step sovereignty surgery executed in sequence, each step building on the last, each targeting a different layer of foreign influence infrastructure. Step 1 was military. February 2023. The French flag comes down at a military camp near Ouagadougou. Approximately 400 French Special Forces personnel are expelled from Burkina Faso, following the formal termination of the military cooperation agreement signed in January. This is confirmed by documented records of French military withdrawal from West Africa, a process that ran from 2022 to 2025 and saw France lose the majority of its military presence across the continent. The hard infrastructure of foreign military influence, the bases, the personnel, the intelligence apparatus embedded in special forces cooperation, is removed. Step 1, complete. But Traore understood something that the expulsion of French soldiers alone could not fix. Military presence is visible. It is photographable. It makes headlines when it leaves. Journalists can document it. Governments can announce it. Citizens can celebrate it. The soft infrastructure of foreign influence is different. It is invisible. It has humanitarian branding. It holds press conferences in Geneva. It issues reports to the UN Human Rights Council. It shows up in the annual report of USAID and the European Commission's Development Fund. And it does not leave just because you ask soldiers to go home. It is designed to persist, to continue operating through changes of government, through elections, through coups, through whatever political upheaval happens on the surface. Step 2 was financial. October 2025, the BDT decree. All NGO accounts must move to the National Treasury. Every wire transfer, every grant disbursement, every donor payment, visible, traceable, auditable by the sovereign government of Burkina Faso for the first time. This step is critical because it targets the funding mechanism of the soft occupation framework directly. Not the organizations themselves yet, but their financial lifeline. The external money pipeline that allows foreign-funded entities to operate on Burkinabe soil without financial accountability to the Burkinabe state. 9 months were given for compliance. The decree was not secret. It was published. It was confirmed by Financial Afrique, by APA News, by Ecofin Agency. Every NGO in the country knew it existed, knew the deadline, and had 9 months to move a bank account. Step 2, initiate it, and then comes Step 3, April 15, 2026. The Ministry of Territorial Administration releases its decree. 118 organizations are dissolved. Not because they did anything wrong in the past 9 months, because in 9 months, 270 days, they did nothing at all. They refused to comply with Step 2. And in doing so, they revealed themselves. This is the insight that every Western outlet missed. The dissolution order was not the crackdown. The dissolution order was the result of a 9-month compliance test that 118 organizations chose to fail. The government did not move to dissolve them in July. It did not move in October. It did not move in January. It waited the full period, gave every possible opportunity, and then enforced the law exactly as it had been written. Traore did not wake up on April 15th and decide to dissolve civil society. He signed a decree in July 2025, gave organizations a full year to comply, watched as they refused, and then enforced the law that had been in place since the beginning. That is not repression, that is governance. And if you look at the 3 steps together, we expel military forces, mandate financial transparency, dissolve the organizations that refuse transparency. What you see is not a pattern of authoritarian consolidation. You see a pattern of sovereignty reconstruction. The military layer of foreign influence, removed. The financial architecture of foreign-funded parallel governance, exposed and dismantled. The organizational network that refused to submit to either dissolved. Each step targets a different layer of the same system. Each step is legally grounded. Each step follows from the previous one. And together, they constitute the most systematic dismantling of post-colonial influence infrastructure that West Africa has seen since independence. There is a phrase for this in international relations: structural decolonization, not symbolic decolonization, the renaming of streets and the removal of statues. Structural, the actual operational removal of the mechanisms through which external powers maintain influence over nominally independent states. Traore is not talking about decolonization, he is executing it. January 29th, 2026. Every political party in Burkina Faso, more than 100, is dissolved. Another headline that was reported as proof of dictatorship and analyzed as nothing more. But in the context of the three-step surgery, it makes a different kind of sense. Political parties in Burkina Faso's recent history had been vectors of externally funded political influence, the civilian layer of the same framework that used NGOs for information and external banks for financial control. Dissolve the parties and you remove the domestic political structures through which external actors have historically shaped electoral outcomes and policy priorities. The surgery is deeper than most observers realized. And the question is never about Burkina Faso alone. It was never only about what happens in Ouagadougou, because the rest of Africa is watching, and some of them are taking notes. The question was never about NGOs. It was about what comes next. And Traore already has the answer. According to documented records of French military withdrawal from West Africa, France lost the substantial majority of its military footprint across the continent between 2022 and 2025. The bases are gone. The soldiers came home. But analysts who have tracked the financial flows note that the influence architecture, the funding pipelines, the information networks, the externally anchored civil society ecosystem continued operating after the flags were lowered. Burkina Faso is now the first country in the Sahel to target all three layers simultaneously: military, financial, and organizational. Mali is watching. Niger is watching. And the question that nobody in the Western press has yet dared to ask is the one that will define the next decade in West Africa. What happens when the rest of the continent decides that Traore's surgery is a template, not an exception? On January 29, 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formally withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. The regional bloc that for decades served as the primary institutional framework for West African governance, and, critics argue, as a mechanism through which external powers maintain collective influence over member states through conditionality, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. Their exit was not impulsive. It followed 12 months of formal notice, exactly as required by ECOWAS charter rules. They did not storm out. They left by the book. On July 6, 2024, the leaders of all three countries signed a confederation treaty, formalizing the alliance of Sahel states. The AES. A new entity with its own passports, its own military command structure, and critically, its own stated philosophy. That sovereignty over Sahelian territory means sovereignty over everything that happens on that territory, including what foreign-funded organizations do there, including where their money comes from, including who they report to and what information they transmit. This is the geopolitical context that transforms the NGO dissolution from a domestic story into a continental one. Because what Burkina Faso did on April 15th is not just about 118 organizations in one country. It is about a doctrine, a demonstrated proof that a sovereign African government can legally, systematically, and without a single shot fired, dismantle the organizational infrastructure of external influence, can survive the Western reaction. And there is a Western reaction. There always is. Amnesty International called the dissolution a flagrant attack on fundamental rights. Their Sahel researchers stated that the action contradicts Burkina Faso's constitution and international human rights obligations. Human Rights Watch issued similar language. The standard institutional apparatus of Western civil society criticism was deployed with precision and speed. And here is what is significant about that reaction. It is now structurally weakened in a way that it was not 5 years ago. Because Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the international human rights framework they represent are themselves part of the ecosystem that Traore is targeting. They receive funding from Western foundations and governments. Their reports shape the narrative that Western governments use to apply diplomatic and financial pressure on African states. Their researchers operate in the same information ecosystem as the organizations being dissolved. They are not neutral observers of the soft occupation framework. They are, in the structural sense that Cambridge scholars described, components of it. When Amnesty issues a condemnation of Burkina Faso's NGO dissolution, they are not simply defending human rights in the abstract. They are defending, whether consciously or not, the specific organizational architecture that makes their model of international influence possible. The architecture that requires civil society to be externally funded, externally accountable, and externally networked in ways that operate parallel to, and sometimes in tension with, the sovereign government of the country in question. That is not to say human rights are unimportant. They are foundational. The question is, who gets to define them, who enforces them, and whose interests are served by the specific institutions claiming that authority? Traore's answer, and the AES's collective answer, is clear. Not Brussels, not Geneva, not Washington, Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey. Now look at the broader board. The French military withdrawal from West Africa between 2022 and 2025 did not happen only in Burkina Faso. France closed or was expelled from bases in Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire. According to analysis by multiple regional observers, France attempted to reorganize this withdrawal as a strategic repositioning, maintaining influence through different channels rather than admitting defeat. Those different channels? Diplomatic pressure through ECOWAS, funding through development aid conditioned on policy compliance, and a dense NGO ecosystem that continued to gather, process, and transmit information about the political and security landscape of countries that had just expelled French soldiers. The soft occupation framework was, in this reading, the contingency plan, the backup architecture, the way to maintain influence after the hard assets were gone. And it was a contingency plan that had been in place for decades, not built in response to the military withdrawals, but available when those withdrawals became necessary. Burkina Faso is now targeting that backup architecture, systematically, legally, and without asking permission. The question for the rest of the continent is not whether Traore is right or wrong. The question is whether the model is replicable. Whether a government with limited resources, facing simultaneous security challenges and economic pressure, can successfully execute a three-step sovereignty surgery without triggering a reaction that collapses it from the outside. So far, the answer in Burkina Faso appears to be yes. And that answer is more dangerous to the soft occupation framework than any single dissolution decree. Because once one country demonstrates that it can be done, legally, sequentially, without military escalation, the template becomes available to every government in the region that has been watching and wondering if it was possible. The CFA-Franc debate is accelerating. The AES military confederation is deepening. New strategic partnerships are reshaping the balance of external relationships across the Sahel. Each of these developments is connected. Each of them reflects the same underlying question. What does sovereignty actually mean in post-colonial Africa, and who gets to answer it? There is also the security dimension that rarely gets the analysis it deserves. Burkina Faso is fighting an active insurgency. The Sahel is one of the most volatile security environments on the continent. In that context, the question of who is gathering and transmitting security intelligence to whom, through what channels, with what accountability, is not abstract. It is operational. It is existential. If foreign-funded organizations embedded in conflict zones are collecting and transmitting security data to external actors whose interests may not align with Burkina Faso's, the sovereignty issue is not merely political. It is a direct security concern. That is the context in which the INSO arrests and the subsequent NGO dissolution must be understood. Not as the actions of a government that fears scrutiny, but as the actions of a government that is fighting for its survival and has identified, with evidence, a vulnerability in its own territory. Burkina Faso is answering it, one decree at a time. The final move in this sovereignty surgery isn't about Burkina Faso at all. It's about what happens when the rest of Africa watches and decides to follow. We started with the headline. Burkina Faso junta cracks down on civil society. We end with three things that headline will never tell you. First, what happened on April 15, 2026 was not spontaneous. It was the third step in a deliberate legal sequence strategy that began in July 2025 and followed a logic that every outlet covering it failed to trace in full. Step 1, remove the military layer of foreign influence. Step 2, expose the financial architecture. Step 3, dissolve the organizations that refuse to submit to that exposure. This is not repression. This is the documented, stepwise reassertion of sovereignty over every layer of a foreign influence infrastructure, hard, financial, and organizational. Second, the NGO ecosystem in post-colonial West Africa is not simply a collection of well-meaning charities. According to peer-reviewed scholarship published by Cambridge University Press, it is the institutional successor to colonial administration, performing state substitute governance functions, maintaining external financial dependencies, and enabling the flow of political, security, and administrative information from sovereign African territory to foreign decision-makers. That structural reality does not mean every NGO worker is a spy. It means the system they operate within was architected in ways that serve interests other than the communities it claims to help. Understanding that distinction is the difference between reading the news and understanding what the news is actually about. Third, and most important, the West African Sahel is not being destabilized. It is being restructured. The alliance of Sahel states, the expulsion of foreign military forces, the dissolution of externally funded civil society organizations. These are not signs of a region falling apart. They are signs of a region deciding for the first time in 60 years what kind of sovereignty it actually wants. That process is messy. It involves real trade-offs, real security challenges, and real human costs. But it is a process driven by African governments making deliberate choices about their own future, not a crisis imposed from outside. You watched this entire video because something in the first 25 words told you there was a story here, that the standard coverage was missing. You were right. And the fact that you watched, that you sought out a 40-minute analysis when a 2-minute headline was available, is itself significant. Because the soft occupation framework depends more than anything else on the assumption that most people will accept the surface reading, that they will not ask the second question or the third, that the framing supplied by institutions with interests in the story will be the framing that sticks. The next time a headline tells you an African government is cracking down, stop. Ask who is being cracked down on. Ask who funds them. Ask whether the government gave them time to comply before taking action. Ask what the financial records would show. Ask whether the scholars who study this region have a more complex account than the press release from an international NGO. Those questions are not cynical. They are not pro-junta. They are not even particularly radical. They are the basic tools of independent analysis, the same tools that every journalist claims to use and too few actually deploy when the subject is Africa and the accused is an African government. The asymmetry is worth naming. When a Western government dissolves an organization, the coverage focuses on the legal process, the stated rationale, and the precedent. When an African government does the same, the coverage focuses on the pattern of authoritarianism, the condemnation from international bodies, and the threat to democracy. The standard is not applied equally. And recognizing that asymmetry, naming it clearly without apology, is the beginning of genuine understanding. Africa is not asking for your permission anymore. That sentence is not rhetoric. It is a description of what is happening in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey, right now. What you do with that information is up to you. But you cannot unknow it. If you want to understand the financial architecture that Traore targeted with the BDT decree, what the CFA franc system actually is, how it works, and why 14 African nations are now debating whether to exit it. That story is on this channel. It is longer, more complex, and more important than anything the mainstream press will tell you about it. The next video is waiting. Take the next step.